All right, we're really diving into some intriguing stuff today with this deep dive, folks. You guys sent in this article, The Roman Catholic Church and the Nation, and wow, it does not hold back.
Yeah, it's a bold one for sure.
It jumps right into this whole idea of like the Vatican's power, which,
Mhm.
okay, on the surface, we all know the Vatican, right? The Pope, the center of the Catholic Church, lots of history. But this article frames it in a way I hadn't really considered before.
It's unique, right? You don't have any other world leaders in quite the same position.
Exactly. It's like, yeah, there are countries with a state religion, but the Vatican's the only one that's both a spiritual leader and its own political entity, a whole country.
It's both at the same time, and that's where it gets really interesting, because it gives the Vatican this freedom, a way to engage with global issues that a president or a prime minister, even a Catholic one, just doesn't have.
The article even uses those examples. Trump, Putin, both claiming Christian faith, but at the end of the day, they've got to put their own nations first. The Vatican, theoretically, doesn't.
In theory. And that's what makes it such a fascinating and potentially risky dynamic. Because is that freedom, that global perspective, does it actually benefit the average Catholic in, say, Kansas or Poland or wherever? Or does it risk creating even more distance between the Vatican and the people it's supposed to serve?
It's almost like the more global you get, the less connected you might be to those local concerns. And that's where I feel like this article really gets into the weeds. Because it argues that the Vatican, particularly since the 1960s, has really shifted its focus towards these big picture global issues.
Right. They talk about ecumenism, which is that whole push for dialogue and unity between different Christian denominations, and then things like human rights, the environment, social justice issues, all incredibly important topics, of course.
Absolutely. But, and this is the author's point, are those overshadowing the more traditional spiritual needs of Catholics who are dealing with, things like secularism, moral relativism, all those forces that seem to be pulling people away from religion in general? It's almost like, imagine being at a family dinner and all of a sudden the conversation goes from, how was your day at school, to a deep dive on global economic policy. Like, it's important stuff, sure, but it can feel really jarring if that's not what you were expecting or needing at that moment.
Totally. And that feeling of disconnect is something the author picks up on, especially when you look at the Catholic Church's own history, its own internal prophecies even.
Wait, prophecies, like predicting the future kind of prophecies. Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, so within Catholic tradition, you have these prophecies and predictions that have been debated and discussed for centuries. Some are very specific, others more open to interpretation. But the author points to a few that talk about Rome, the seat of the Catholic Church, potentially losing its way.
Losing its way, how so?
Well, some interpretations talk about a future pope who might stray from the faith, who might embrace teachings that are at odds with traditional doctrine. Now, whether you take these prophecies literally or see them as more symbolic, the fact that they exist within the Church's own tradition, it adds a whole other layer to this conversation about where the Catholic Church is headed.
It's like, it's one thing to have critics outside the church saying you're on the wrong track. But when you have these ancient prophecies, warnings from within that suggest a potential crisis of faith, well, you can't just brush that aside easily. It raises these questions of authority, of legitimacy.
Exactly. It's like, can the Vatican maintain its authority, its claim to be the true voice of the Church, if it's also embracing values and ideas that seem to contradict what some of those ancient prophecies warned about?
Yeah.
That's a tension the author really digs into, and it's something that I think a lot of Catholics, maybe without even realizing it, are wrestling with today.
It's like they're trying to thread a needle, right? Stay true to these ancient traditions, but also like not be completely out of step with the modern world.
Absolutely. This is where the author brings up a really interesting example, Nancy Pelosi.
Ooh, okay, so we're getting into the real world implications of all this. For those who might not know, Nancy Pelosi, she was a prominent U.S. politician, former Speaker of the House, and a Catholic.
A Catholic who very openly supports abortion rights, which puts her at odds with some pretty fundamental Catholic teachings.
Right, and this isn't just like a, well, I'm personally opposed, but kind of situation. The article makes it clear that Pelosi's support for abortion rights comes from a deep-seated belief in a woman's right to choose. So it's like, how does the church square that circle?
Well, and the author argues that this is where you really see that tension between like traditional doctrine and this more modern liberal approach to Catholicism playing out.
And it's not just theoretical. This actually led to a pretty intense showdown between Pelosi and her local bishop.
Right. Yeah, it's a really fascinating story. He actually attempted to excommunicate her over this issue.
Whoa, excommunicate, like that's the big one, right? That's basically saying you're no longer considered part of the church.
Exactly. And it really highlights that internal struggle within the church. You got these bishops, these local leaders trying to hold the line on traditional teachings. And then you have, well, Rome, the Vatican, which seems to be taking a more, shall we say, flexible approach.
So what message does that send to the average Catholic sitting in the pews? It's like, wait a minute, the rules are different depending on who you are or how powerful you are.
It creates a real dilemma, and it kind of goes back to that whole question of authority that we were talking about earlier.
Hmm.
Because if the rules can be bent or even broken depending on the situation, it kind of undermines that whole idea of the church as this like unwavering moral authority.
Right, because if it's not clear what the church stands for, then what's the point? Right. And this isn't just an American issue. The article makes it clear that this tension is playing out all over the world.
Yeah, they talk about, for example, how Catholicism is evolving in places like South America, where you have this blending of indigenous beliefs with traditional Catholic practices.
Right. Like, what does it even mean to be Catholic in those contexts? Is it about adhering to this very strict set of doctrines handed down from Rome, or is it more about like how those doctrines are interpreted and lived out in different cultures?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's something that the church is really grappling with, especially as it's trying to figure out its place in an increasingly globalized world.
And then you have Pope Francis and some of his actions, like recognizing those state-appointed bishops in China, his outreach to the Muslim world.
These are big moves, and they signal a real shift in thinking about where the future of the church lies. It's like they're looking at the global landscape and saying, okay, maybe we need to rethink our priorities.
Which, I gotta say, that's gotta be a tough pill to swallow for, like, a lot of Catholics, especially in places like Europe and North America, where the church has been losing ground for decades.
It's like you've held on to your faith in a world that increasingly seems hostile to it, and now it feels like even the church itself is moving on.
It's a feeling of abandonment that the author really captures, and it gets to the heart of this question. Can the Catholic Church be all things to all people, or will it have to choose between trying to preserve its traditions and adapting to a changing world?
And if it does have to choose, what does that mean for the future of Catholicism?
It's like, where does Catholicism even go from here? You know, if it's not just about holding on to those traditional beliefs, if it's also about adapting, evolving, what does that even look like?
That's the million-dollar question, and honestly, I don't think anyone has a clear answer. The Catholic Church, it's this ancient institution steeped in tradition, but it's also made up of millions of individuals, each with their own experiences, their own interpretations of the faith.
And that's where it gets really messy, right? Because you can't just like take a poll and say, okay, majority rules, this is what we believe now.
Right, it's not that simple. Doctrine, faith, it's not something you can just change on a whim. But at the same time, if the church wants to stay relevant, if it wants to speak to the needs of people in the 21st century, well, it can't just stay frozen in time either.
It's like, how do you balance that tension between like preserving the core of the faith, the things that have been passed down for centuries, with also acknowledging that the world is a very different place than it was 50 years ago, let alone 500.
Exactly. And the author we read today, they seem to be saying that the church might be reaching a breaking point, that this tension between tradition and reform, it can't hold forever.
So are we talking about like a schism, a split in the church?
It's certainly possible, and there are historical precedents for this kind of thing happening. But it's not like anyone can predict the future. What we can say is that the Catholic Church is facing some serious challenges, some really tough questions about its identity and its purpose in the world.
It's a lot for anyone to wrestle with, whether you're a devout Catholic, just someone who's curious about religion, or maybe even someone who's completely turned away from faith. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about what happens inside the walls of the Vatican.
Exactly. The decisions the church makes, the direction it chooses to go, it has implications for all of us, whether we realize it or not. It shapes our culture, our politics, our understanding of what it means to be human in a world that often feels increasingly devoid of meaning.
So we're leaving you with a lot to chew on today, folks. No easy answers, but hopefully some food for thought as you continue your own exploration of this endlessly fascinating, endlessly complex institution that is the Catholic Church.